Let's look at the 2010 budget of the federal government to get a sense of where to begin tackling this problem. On the spending side, we have Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, Defense, all the other programs in the federal government, including law enforcement, education, agriculture, space and science, energy, and homeland security, to name just a few. And finally, interest on the national debt. That's everything. These programs, along with interest payments on the national debt, are known as mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is currently 62% of all federal spending and is the fastest growing part of the budget. These are all the other programs in the federal government and are called discretionary spending. They make up the remaining 38% of the federal budget. Okay, now, how do we pay for all this? Taxes. Let's look at our different revenue sources. Personal income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, and other revenue. The rest? This is our budget deficit for the year. It's how much money America will need to borrow to pay for everything on the other side of this coin. When you're in a hole that you're trying to get out of, the first thing you need to do is stop digging. Serious budget reform is the first step in the right direction. The current budget process is not designed to address our overall fiscal challenge.
I think there's broad agreement that in a time of real deep recession that it's okay to run budget deficits, even big budget deficits. When the economy begins to recover, we really need to do something to make sure that we don't keep running even bigger budget deficits and adding to the debt.
The problem is really quite simple. Americans want lots of services from their government, and they have made promises in law that will mean higher federal spending in the future.
When we've had budget problems in the past, our leaders have done a better job of working together and enacting. During the 1990s, for example, tough budget controls, along with a growing economy, helped make fiscal responsibility a reality.
In a few moments, I will sign into law the first balanced budget in a generation.
Those budget controls helped take us from large and growing deficits to large and growing surpluses. But these controls expired in 2002, and the economy was recovering from a recession. The budget situation in Washington has been out of balance ever since.
There are two different kinds of categories of budget tools that can really help fix the situation. There's one category of tools that enforce budget deals.
For mandatory programs and taxes, there is pay-as-you-go, or PAYGO. For discretionary programs, there are spending caps. Let's look at PAYGO first.
I've long been an advocate for PAYGO. If somebody is going to propose a tax cut, they have to pay for it. If somebody is going to propose an increase in mandatory spending, they have to find a way to pay for it.
Our fiscal challenge is too great to be solved with any one step alone, and we can't wait to act. And that's why last week I signed into law the PAYGO bill. It says very simply that the United States of America should pay as we go and live within our means again, just like responsible families and businesses do.
Unfortunately, compared to the PAYGO rules of the 90s, this is a weak version. A strong PAYGO would not exempt so many tax cuts and spending increases and would apply to all mandatory programs. The other category of budget tools is discretionary spending caps, which would apply to 38% of the budget.
That limits how much the growth of discretionary spending can go forward each year. Those have been really effective in the past in limiting budget growth and keeping deficits from becoming a greater problem.
PAYGO and spending caps are positive measures, but they only help to keep the problem from getting worse. Many other steps will need to be taken.
Congresses by nature are good with the next election, but they're not good for the next generation. And as a result, Congress for a long time has been ignoring our long-term problems. And the long-term problem is that we're putting so much debt on the books that our kids cannot survive it. During the Bush years, there was not adequate fiscal discipline. For example, the Part D drug benefit, which was an $8 trillion unfunded mandate that shouldn't have gone on the books unless it had been paid for.
But more and more when Congress gets involved with the problem, it ends up making it worse.
The estimated cost of the Medicare D prescription drug bill was $395 billion over 10 years, which was the only cost that was debated and considered. The cost of the program exploded beyond 10 years, adding between 7 and 8 trillion in unfunded promises.
When we should have been digging our way out of the problem, we dug deeper.
If you don't have an attitude within the Congress that wants to limit spending, you're not going to limit spending. And basically, Congress wants to spend money because it's easier to get votes if you spend money than it is if you don't spend money.
One of the solutions to help our annual budget situation is to set a target for the nation's debt levels.
We should talk about something like stabilizing the debt at, say, 60% of GDP. That's a reasonable amount to shoot for. It's higher than we've historically been at, but it still would require an aggressive amount of debt reduction to get there. So it's both tough to do, but politically realistic. That's the kind of goal we need to think about.
The European Monetary Union sets a public debt to GDP target of no higher than 60% for countries using the euro. Countries who exceed the target must take action to reduce their debt or face sanctions. That level is intended to reassure creditors while still allowing room for new borrowing if needed to address emergencies or respond to other events like a recession.
If you wanted to get into the European Union, you couldn't have a public debt that exceeded 60% of your gross national product. Within 2 years, we will have a public debt that is around 70% of our gross national product. So we basically couldn't get in the European Union. Lithuania could get in, but we couldn't get in because we have such a problem with our deficits and our debt.
If we set this goal for ourselves, we'll have a realistic benchmark to shoot for when considering major reforms: defense and other spending, Social Security, healthcare, and taxes. To achieve our fiscal goals, we will have to look at each area of the budget and agree on changes. Next, we'll look at some illustrative approaches, but many other options and combinations of changes exist.